Well, as we take a look at the weather on Veterans Day Monday, we see that mostly it's a dry radar across the U.S. There's a few pockets where we see some showers early in the week, and there is some potential, it sounds like, for maybe more showers as we go through the week in some parts of the country. But overall, things remain relatively dry. What's that going to mean for the drought situation and more? Let's talk weather. Joining us now, Eric Snodgrass. Eric, good to catch up with you this week, my friend. And yeah, I kind of did a poor job setting that up, I think. But we had some rain that's worked through the last couple of days in certain areas. It's helped alleviate some of the drought concerns, but I know drought still remains kind of the big top of mind issue here for much of the country, right?
It does. It's interesting. The drought monitor, it's designed to be a sub-seasonal to seasonal statistic. Okay. It doesn't capture flash drought by design. So you look at it and you're like, wow, almost 88% of the country is in some form of drought. We have about 50, oh gosh, was it 58% in D1 to D4? And then you go back and say, but the beginning of November for the southern plains, parts of the mid-south, parts of the Midwest is one of the wettest, if not that, just the top 10 wettest starts to November. We've had a ton of rain. Some places have picked up, some places, believe it or not, since the start of November, picked up over 12 inches of rain. Talking about parts of Oklahoma, there's even locally heavier there, Arkansas, Missouri. And this is all a part of a bigger pattern shift that it's helping a lot of growers out with just kind of getting that drought worry out of their minds. Now, I talked to numerous growers in Illinois. In fact, I was talking to one yesterday. He said he had 4 inches last week on his farm, no standing water today at all, and the tile drain wasn't running yet, which means we've still got this underlying dry risk because that soil moisture can't recover on just 10 days worth of moisture. But I'll tell you this, the Mississippi is now up to 4 feet above low stage. So that means it jumped up 14 feet at Memphis from where it was at the beginning of last week. So it's nice to see a recovery on that river system. But I'm just sitting here thinking about this, knowing that the pattern's continuing to stay active. We have more storm systems coming across the United States. November looks almost the opposite of October in terms of rainfall. And you sit there and go, okay, does it fill in the hole in the northern plains? Does it fill in the hole in the Canadian prairie? Does it fill in the hole across the East Coast? Because like any year, okay, we just have to think, what does drought look like lasting through winter? Because every year, wherever it sets up in spring, it creeps, right? And so we're always going to pay attention to where the drought doesn't become like undone during winter. So yeah, I've got a lot on my mind with this drought scenario and the way that November starts. I will say this, Jesse, I was impressed overall at how well the models picked up on the pattern change. End of October, beginning of November, we started talking about it way back in the first week of October, that's good. That means I can put some trust in those models going forward. So yeah, that's where we stand. And by the way, Colorado just had in some places a foot of snow over the past into last week. And there's a lot of folks out there in the high plains are like, holy smokes, winter's here. And the rest of us like, no, it's pretty nice outside still. So wild pattern.
Very wild pattern. Well, and we've talked about this before that as we get into winter, trying to get as much rain to fall here before we freeze things up and get into winter could be key because otherwise, you've made this comment a few times, we're going to have a real nasty winter that could eventually melt as we get into the spring. And then I just think about that. That's probably going to be a muddy mess, Eric.
It is. So, it's what I want. I mean, gosh, if the atmosphere ever did what I wanted it to do, what I want is I want it to be front loaded with all the chaotic weather. I know that's bad for holiday travel, but I'd like to have a November, December to be the rough months to recover the moisture early so that when we get through the rest of winter, yeah, it can be cold. I don't care. But when we get into March and April, I don't want there to be a massive flooding problem we have to deal with so we can, get a crop planted early. And I'll just tell you this, Jesse, you think about the lingering drought from this fall, there still is major pockets of it. You think about the fact we're going into a weak La Nina. You think about the fact we also have one of our strongest, what we call PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation signals on the negative side. And that starts to just tell me that I should tell you that next year, the drought risk going into the Midwestern United States is elevated. You say, how elevated? I would put it at 60% based off of historical data. So 6 and 10 years that we had this scenario in fall, the next growing season had drought pressures at some point across the Midwest and Central Plains. So that's why we're talking about this now. It's are we going to do something to get in one of those 4 years out of 10 that doesn't have these issues, or do we have significant drought risk for 2025? And until I see evidence to overturn that, I think we'll just have to keep talking about it being a possibility.
Eric, let's turn our attention to South America. And you and I were talking about this before we went live. Growers there have surpassed last year's planting pace now after we had a lot of questions if they were going to get this in even on time. And here we are with a rapid planting pace in South America, and they've had pretty conducive weather to do so here lately.
Yeah, so I'm think about last year, right? Rains came in September. They didn't do that this year. They were good through the front half of October. So you rewind the clock 3 weeks, they were 35% ahead of where we are this year, right? Then a year ago, in the second half of October, the rain stopped and it didn't rain again until, well, it rained a little bit, but it was way, way, way dry all the way till January, the beginning of January. So they had record dry November and December, dry since 1940. I think 1940 was you can go back that far and look. Then it rained in January, saved the crop, and it was huge. We don't have that this year, right? The monsoon was late, but when it came on, it's come on consistent. They caught up on planting. The crop is in, but I'll just say this: this year's crop went in fast over a certain like 2 to 3 week time period, which means it's all going to go through those stages together. But as it stands, it's just not necessarily the way that you would want to think about there being a problem in Brazil. So much about Brazil's problems are about planting pace than anything else. So I think they got a crop in. They didn't fall outside of the 5 year envelope too much, which means we're probably looking at a decent sized crop in Brazil. If I found a problem in Brazil, maybe it's in the northeast corner, but that's not a big corn and soybean producing area compared to the center west.
Mhm.
Maybe there's going to be a problem with the crop staying in the ground too long, too green, with too much rainfall going into January, maybe even a little bit into February. That could be an issue, but I don't know that anybody's going to be worried about that just yet. And if maybe all of South America was kind of wrapped up into one story, I think Brazil's looking okay, but Argentina might be the area given the La Nina that could be running the risk of drought. But, with a weak La Nina signal like the one we have now, I can't really tell you that that is a kind of done and dusted idea. I think we've got to get a much more robust signal, primarily in the tropics, for me to tell you that there's an issue with Argentina. So at this point, I don't have any sort of a bullish weather story out of South America, especially given the planting that you just saw in the last 3 weeks.
We'll just have to keep our eyes on it here as we go over the next several months. I know the markets will really shift their emphasis to watching the latest forecasts for South America, the 7 to 10 days and more. Eric, as we wrap it up here today, final thoughts. Any
Yeah.
other big weather features around the world that you are paying attention to this week?
Yeah, I'm paying attention to two things. The first one is there is yet another chance at having a tropical system show up in the Caribbean. Now, last week it was Rafael. Rafael missed. That was good. Although there were some places in the south and east that would have loved to have some of that rain, but it missed. But we're watching right now the chance over the next 10 days for another system could come up. It has some Helene look to it. In other words, coming up through the Yucatan Strait and maybe getting pushed off toward the Florida coast. But listen, that's all speculative. I've just seen a couple of the ensemble members go that way. And then there's one last thing. I know that you're a much bigger music buff than I am, but just thinking yesterday, I was telling my son as we were driving home, the radio, I think it was Classic Vinyl, decided to play the wreck of Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot. And I told Grandma, like, this is about a weather event that basically sunk a huge ship on Lake Superior. So I pulled up this morning the weather conditions from that, and here's something that's interesting. 1975, massive La Nina, brutally cold air that's in the Arctic. 2024, weak La Nina, very warm in the Arctic right now. So if you're wondering why we haven't had any of those big November storm systems that can, get into the Great Lakes states or east, we just don't have the push of cold air to shove these things farther to the south. And so it's just amazing to think about the differences between that year and this year. Both have La Ninas, different strength and a totally different picture in the Arctic. So fun to do those historical comparisons, and fantastic song. I mean, if you're a weather guy and you don't know that song, then can you really call yourself a weather guy? I don't think so. So anyway, those are my last thoughts today, Jesse.
Fair enough.
All
Well,
right.
I would agree with you on that one. If you're a weather guy and you don't know that Gordon Lightfoot song,
Yeah.
you need to catch up. Folks
Yeah.
can find more agweather.com, ag-wx.com. Eric Snodgrass, always good to talk with you, my friend. Thanks for giving us the rundown of this week's weather forecast, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, you bet.